The thing about fantasy, which is why, I like the term fantasy, I actually like it more than speculative fiction.
Why?
Because I think speculative fiction is still an attempt to divorce yourself from the genre. As fantasy is here, I'm speculative.
Okay.
Like, all fiction is speculative. It's made up, boo.
Wow. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at the Edinburgh International Book Festival. For those of you who've never been before, welcome for the first time. It's great to have you. And for those of you who are returning, thanks for coming back. It really is one of the best book festivals out there. My name is Jess Brough. I'm a PhD student in psycholinguistics. I'm also a writer. And I have the absolute pleasure to be chatting with Marlon James today, who is the author of 5 novels, the third winning the Man Booker Prize. And he came on to the scene to surprise and shock and put us all in awe again when he turned to what people are calling a fantasy series, a 3-parter, but we can get into that definition later. So please join me in welcoming Marlon James.
Thank you.
Now, before we jump into questions, I just want to remind you all that we'll be taking plenty of time towards the end for audience questions. So please do get those cogs going and, don't be shy. We love hearing your questions. So, Marlon, how are you doing?
I'm fine. I wanted to read a quote from Salman Rushdie, actually.
Okay.
This is from my favorite Rushdie novel, Shame. And it says, between shamelessness and shame lies the axis upon which we turn. Meteorological conditions at both these poles are the most extreme, ferocious type. Shamelessness and shame, the roots of violence.
Thank you so much for that. I would love to sort of begin this conversation by, addressing the category that this book has been put into. So people are calling it a fantasy series, but it follows this tradition that is more like folklore. Would you call it fantasy?
I do, actually, because I don't necessarily believe in the sort of, for want of a better term, ghettoizing of genre.
Okay.
I think sometimes when people classify books, they do it to rank them. And yes, there is fantasy that stays within the formula. Yes, there are detective novels. There's detective fiction that stays within the formula. But there are also a million, chubby, white, over-literate New York straight men who somehow still have 3 girlfriends despite being married.
Yeah.
There are tons of really, really stuffy college novels where characters are having way too much sex.
It's implausible.
Yeah, so I mean that's a formula too. It's so if we're looking for formulas, we'll always find them. The thing about fantasy, which is why I like the term fantasy, I actually like it more than speculative fiction.
Why?
Because I think speculative fiction is still an attempt to divorce yourself from the genre. As fantasy is here, I'm speculative.
Okay.
Like, all fiction is speculative. It's made up, boo. It's, it's. But I also think that, one of the things we forget, is that fantasy and sci-fi are the genres that ask the big questions. Fahrenheit 51, rather, was asking questions we're only asking now.
Yeah.
And I talked about it a couple of years ago about the book burning and so on, which is, it's not always physical burning that's happening in the States, but we're definitely having a whole new level of banning of books and silencing of books and destroying of books going on in the States. And the sci-fi novels got there first.
Yeah.
So so I do embrace the fantasy tag. That said, I think people who actually did believe this was going to be a black Game of Thrones were probably disappointed. Sorry.
Do you mind that comparison?
The problem is I'm the one who started it.
No. Well, that's on you then.
Yeah, I was trying to find a sort of shorthand, and it was in this magazine which I thought nobody read. Turns out everybody who reads it writes in media.
Yeah.
And I said it. But the main reason I said it is because two things I do love about George is, one, that he refuses the idea that once you become an adult or a fiction writer, an adult, you let go of make-believe, which has no precedence in any culture. That's why we have mythology. That's why the myths, if you read them, are crazy. They're not children's stories. But I love that people thought they were, because I had a wacky childhood reading that stuff. And they left me alone. But it's so that I also do, I also kind of do like how he just kills off people at random.
Yeah.
But yeah, it got to the point where he called. Like, I heard it writing an African version of my book. I'm like, no, George, I'm not doing that.
That for you to say it, it's almost okay. For him to say it, you just, not. Would you say that you were actually quite inspired by Game of Thrones then, in that sense?
Inspired in the sense that that I didn't have to leave really, really adult concerns while still writing about witches and demons and dragons.
Yeah.
And George, of course, but I mean, the whole genre that we're calling magical realism is a bunch of great writers who don't think fiction should ever leave make-believe. That there's still things that are unexplained, unexplainable. There's still things that go bump in the night. And, if anybody's read Marquez's autobiography, Living to Tell the Tale, it's as wild as it's fiction. And he said, if you grew up in the Caribbean, I love that he calls himself a Caribbean writer. If you grew up in the Caribbean, then your reality outstrips the wildest fiction. And it's true, because I grew up there. Yeah. And it's crazy.
Yeah, the story is in the ordinary things, the day-to-day. So with fantasy, with world building, I think, what's interesting for me as a reader is thinking about what the writer has chosen to borrow from the real world and keep from the real world, and then what they've chosen to totally change. And, we've got examples like that with your use of the shape-shifting and, so many other examples of things that aren't in our, aren't in our world. What did you want to borrow? What was important for you to keep in the world that you're creating?
I think one of the things that did borrow was the shape-shifting, not just in terms of people turning into animals, but people turning into different identities and people changing and growing. The Sologon that's in this is not a Sologon that's in the previous book. No. The Sologon at the end of this book is not the one that was at the beginning of it. And, and she's changed herself in all these ways and evolved in all these ways, and she learns many things and she unlearns things as well. And I wanted to keep that. I was very happy that I get to use actual dragons in this book. And, a lot of the folklore I grew up with, the mythologies that I learned, the everything from, Mami Wata to Caribbean myths like Old Hague and so on, and to use not just the African, but the African that endured in the Caribbean, to use all of that. At the same time, one of the things that I did retain in this world is that Sologon is still dealing with major sexism. Yeah. And yes, it's set in the past, but some men still ain't shit.
But why focus on sexism?
Well, I think because, if you're going to talk about the story of monarchy, you're talking about that sort of thing, especially African monarchy. Because a lot of African monarchy, African traditions were they were matrilineal. Yeah. And a lot of that continued. And one of the main things in Moonridge is what happens when the matrilineal line is destroyed. Yeah. And it's always been the two warring conflicts between Sologon and the character Daisy, even in the previous book, where Sologon is very much, we need to return to what this thing was, or we're going to pay for it. And, the AEZ is, we need to keep things the way we are, or we're going to pay for it. And they both have this sort of view of the future that is hell-bent on damnation if we don't stick to our change.
It's interesting about them is they also still recognize it feels like they still recognise that there's going to be damnation anyway. So it's like, but we have mentioned Sologon. Maybe now is a good time to hear you read something from the book to introduce the voice.
I'm sure. Actually, I was going to read a section, but I can't find it. The section where she actually becomes the Moon Witch, which I can't find. So I'm going to read something else.
Great.
So set this up. So Sologon is living in a house of ill repute. It's called a brothel. And Sologon is not one of the women plying the trade. She finds a way to drug her customers, and they leave feeling they have the greatest night ever. And when she really drugs them and steals from them. But one day she kind of steals the wrong thing. She steals a charm, and the charm summons a demon. And poor girl don't know what happened, but then this demon shows up at the house of pleasurable goods and services. So the demon is chasing her and chases her all the way back to her room, wreaks lots of havoc. And behind the demon is this woman. So I'm going to take it right at the point where the demon bursts into her bedroom. He, the thing, so high his head scraped the ceiling, one hand thin and weak-looking, the other thick as his body and touching the floor. 2 legs tall as trees, but one shorter than the other. He shifted and scrambled like a spider, slamming down his big hand and smashing tables and urns and vases and throwing whatever he wrapped his long fingers around. Then he sees the girl and shriek again. He goes straight for her. She climbed the ladder fast. She never climbed anything so fast, and run to her room. The smashing, the shrieking, the screaming move closer until the little door get ripped off. The beast still screeching. The girl is shaking so hard that each blink scatter tears. You better thank the gods you're not a boy thief, or I'll be calling 10 men to pull the ukundunga out of your little shithole, the woman say. She, a lady looking like somebody of great nobility and importance, her dark lips and wide nose in a frown, her annoyed eyebrows sitting below a pattern of white dots that run down her left cheek, an igia on her head like a large black flower, and a long white basotha blanket around her shoulders with a pattern of a warrior. A tall woman and wide. She looked like she could hold all her children at once. Cheeks of a woman who laughed without warning, without joke. The little girl is still trembling. The ukundunka, that's the name of the monster, pawing at her sleeping sheets. Where is it, little girl? The little girl can't get the words out. Where, she say? The talisman, little fool. My little figure in onyx. Don't make me ask for it again, or I'll let him search you. The ukundunka lowers his head right in front of her. A head long like a horse, eyes like a wolf, teeth like a crocodile, breath like she don't know. They are one, you understand me? The ukundunka and the talisman, they are one. Let me tell you a story. Once after we long married, I said to my husband, dearest husband, everybody know that you are an important man. Everybody know that it is important business that keep you out late at night. The God knows how I worry. I worry so much that I ask a conjurer to make something to keep my husband safe. Yes, husband, I say, you carry this talisman and ukundunka will protect you. An important man like you with enemies everywhere, why, you could be in a ditch. So every night, if I flip the hourglass more than 5 times and there's no sign of my husband, I send this thing searching for him. To keep him safe, you understand me? Lo, one night he not only come home late, but he come home without it. Lost it, he say. He said, don't bother find it, for I don't know where it gone. I say, don't worry, husband, I soon find it and deal with who take it. Now look at it resting in the bosom of a whore, and not a whore. You're in a whorehouse, odds not good that you're a nun. And not a whore, you're not a cook, and not no whore. Then why this room smell of men? The little girl have no answer. She could have said, yes, the room stunk of men, but none of that stink is on her. But a talk of sleeping poison would lead to Miss Azora finding out. The noble woman eyed her deep, inspecting her. Maybe you can give him a child. I'm certainly not about to suffer one. Certainly not with him. The shock on your face. You really are a child. I never whore. I never whore with none of them. Never, eh? I robbed them. The little girl is getting more disturbed by the woman's stare than by the Ukundunka's hiss. For gold, cowrie, money notes, talk to me, girl. The little girl can do nothing but stare at her again. I take whatever they have that shouldn't be hanging loose, and I keep it. For Mrs. Zura give us nothing. Nothing at all? Your clothes, we buy. I said she don't give us nothing, except for one thing. She give all of us a rape the first time she sell us, and charge the man triple money. So I mix them a potion, and then I rob them. So they take nothing from you, but you take plenty from them? See here, girl, you in the wrong house. I'm not leaving one user for another. Who say you even have use? The little girl leave with the noblewoman that night. Mr. Zora said nothing. Mr. Azura don't move from the spot where the Ukundunka threw her, so who knows what is the fate of her? The noblewoman asked her a name. I don't have none. What? Well, what do people call you? Little one, little dung, little girl, little whore, girl, forbidden lily. Enough. You choose a name, and that is what we will call you. I call my mother Sologon. See the girl take her dead mother's name 177 years ago. 170 times that the great gourd of the world spin around the sun. Sologon. Thank you.
So, for those of you who, I'm sure you all do know, this is the second book in the series, and the first book focuses on the character of the tracker, who we are given a sense of sort of his youth, but this book we have a lot more focus on Sologon's childhood and her trajectory through life. Why was that important for you to start at sort of age 13?
I don't know if I have a sensible answer to that because I didn't start there.
Okay.
Like most of my books, where I start is not the first line people read. I think the first line that I wrote for this novel, Sologon was on a ship sailing somewhere, and I think it's like in page 400 or something now. So I didn't know that I had all of this. It's just that once I started writing a scene from her childhood, and I became really fascinated with it. And because Sologon's take on this child is ultimately a bigger take than Tracker's. Tracker's is, I'm just supposed to find some boy. Yeah. Sologon knows the whole machinations of empire. And because she knows, she's one of the few people. It's not revealed in Black Leopard, Red Wolf, not really. But she's one of the few people on this mission who knows the stakes. In fact, I think only 3 people know. She's one of the few people who know the full stakes. So it was important for me for people to see the whole stakes. And but I could have easily done that and just write something about court intrigue. But it's, it would have been easy to do that. But she's also somebody with very personal stakes. Yeah. In what happens, and I wanted to explore those. I wanted to explore those stakes. I wanted to explore somebody who is royalty adjacent, but is not royalty.
And were you expecting to write a story about revenge?
No, even though I love revenge.
Revenge is quite sexy.
It is. It really is. No, I didn't set out to do that. I mean, most of the stuff I write, certainly with this. The character is almost pretty much blank to me. And I just wait for them to reveal stuff. And Sologon had a lot to say. But, yeah, it goes into that when people ask the question, how much of this book I knew before I started writing. I really didn't know any of it.
So you hadn't chosen Sologon as the main character for the next book when you were writing Black Leopard? Or?
Not until I was on halfway to Black Leopard. Then I realized that it's her story. And I started to be more deliberate with her absences in that book. But I didn't know until, writing this. I didn't know until near the end of this who's going to tell the third one. No,
I'm not now. We'll start throwing names out.
But yeah, there's just something about a 177-year-old black woman with zero F's to give. I figure this is a family show, so I'm not going to swear.
I think you can swear.
Yeah, well, too late now. And and I just became really curious. What is on her mind? How did she get in this room? The thing about all the novels is that they all begin in the same place, really. They're being interrogated by this tracker, by this investigator, this inquisitor. Yeah. And they all sort of begin there and they all sort of end there. And I really became curious as to how did you get here? And also, what the hell do you do for 177 years?
So are you the inquisitor?
Kinda, but I know stuff he doesn't know. But it was that. But it's... The way I wrote this novel, I started in a different present tense than how it begins here, because I started pretty far in the story, and that's what made me curious. It made me stop. It's almost when you put the movie on pause, and I go, "But hold on, how did we get here?" And I put that scene on pause and went all the way back to figure out how did we get from her childhood to this point. And then I felt like I was picking up where I left off when I rejoined that scene of her on that ship heading towards Omororo.
Well, she comes into her power and her magic through trauma, essentially. Was that intentional? Were you looking for a reason for her to pick up her wind, not wind?
Yes and no, but I also, I'm also very skeptical of trauma narratives, which is why I think for one, Sologon's story begins way early, even though it begins in trauma. But also, she doesn't define herself by that. Trauma is not her origin. For example, if she was going by trauma as her origin, she'd be older than 177. She doesn't start counting her years until she's 13. And she gives herself her own name. So it says 177, but she's really more like, okay, 177 plus 13, what's that? Whatever that is. Can you tell the field match? I did pass the counting, though.
We'll talk about the way you count in this book later.
But you see, that's where she chooses to count her years.
Yeah.
And it's not the first time that Sologon has been either chose a situation or been put in a situation where she has to define herself.
Well, I kind of want to, zone in on numbers, if that's okay. I'm really excited to talk to you about your use of language in the book and who and what you've borrowed from. So, if you've read it, you'll know that the ages are counted and the years are counted like 10 and 4 instead of 14. And it reminds me of, languages in the world, belonging to different communities and tribes. They're called one-too-many languages, where they don't have words above the number 2, but they can obviously still count. And so much of the language in the book is taken from ancient languages. Yeah. So what was your research process with that, and building this language and this voice?
Well, a lot of it was trying to get a handle, at least the linguistics behind languages, if not necessarily learning them, because it takes a while to learn them, and I haven't fully learned any of them yet. Like Wolof, for example. One of the things I like about Wolof is that it answered something that a lot of people in the Caribbean diaspora still look upon as an inferiority. Like, I've always thought that Jamaican patois was broken English, as if it needs to be fixed.
You grew up thinking that?
I grew up thinking that. That's how I was raised. And this, to me, where I'm speaking now, is proper English, and patois is some sort of broken form. And one of the ways in which, Jamaican patois works, for example, is there are no books in Jamaican patois. It's the book them. There is no went. And, nobody says went. That's why I know when somebody's a fake Jamaican. He went there, you're not Jamaican. It's not went, it's him did go.
Yeah.
And it's him did go, him soon go, him won't go, him can't go. We even say he going go. And I always looked at it as one sort of this kind of quaintness about patois until I started to read and really check the rules of certain languages like Wolof. Like in Wolof, verbs are always present tense.
Yeah.
So action is always a dynamic thing. You're not just you haven't seen something, you're still seeing it.
So what's that doing for the listener?
What it does is that it grounds you in immediacy and it grounds you in the present, and action is always active, which I thought was fantastic. And then I thought, man, I've been speaking this fantastic thing, which I thought was an inferior thing all this time.
So learning about Wolof gave you an appreciation of patois.
Patois and just just black language and black English.
Yeah.
That a lot of these things we think are these sort of backward connotations or backward uses of English, when we're really just sort of spicing it with stuff that survived the slave ship.
Yeah.
I just didn't realize it, that him soon go or him did go was just one of those things that I was kept with it. So things like that. Realizing that some languages don't have gender. I remember saying this to my a reading I did in Jamaica, and we're talking about transgender and non-binary. Yeah. And I say, you ever notice you have no problem saying them? That how natural it is for you to call a single person them. You never interrogated that.
And what was this person's first language?
No, it was basically Jamaican English, or Black Americans. I'm like, so you ever notice that you're already calling some single people them? Yeah. You've been doing it for hundreds of years. Because those things, is and I'll say it's great when you all recognize pronouns. We've been doing it for a millennia now.
Yeah. It's not a complex new
It's really not
idea.
a complex new thing. If anything, we're finally reconnecting with something very old.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what the language did. So I knew when I was writing this, I had to write language that still sounded current, because language is current. That's one of the things I love about Wolf Hall. I mean, y'all understand, when I was writing this novel, on this side of the desk was Beloved and the other side was Wolf Hall. I just did this every day. I go, I should quit writing. It's
an intimidating space to be between.
It's an intimidating space between those two books, because they're both perfect novels. But the thing I like about Wolf Hall is the present tense it's written in. Because and it's not to not past tense novels, of course, because Beloved is certainly set in the past. But I think there is a certain kind of immediacy and a certain kind of complicity you give the reader. Yeah. Because you can't separate yourself by saying that happened. It's happening. As if you're opening a book, it's happening. And I wanted that.
Yeah, the reader is called in when you're using the present tense. And it's not an easy tense to use. Something that I really enjoyed, but I found quite curious in the book, was how you switched between voices. So we've got Sologon is spoken about in the third person, and then we have Sologon's voice in the first person a little bit later. Why did you switch things up? What was the purpose of that?
I think for Sologon to talk about her past, she had to turn herself into a character. Okay. And I think that whole large first section is in third person. It's Sologon telling us. Yeah. Sologon also has to deal with trust and story. Because a big chunk of this story she doesn't remember. She's remembering somebody telling her. And she says it, because I'm not going to reveal why, because then you have to buy the book. But there's a part of it where she acknowledges, I am telling you a story of myself somebody told me. Yeah. So even when that's in first person, it's still a kind of third person. And I've always been fascinated with point of view in stories, and how choice of person and degrees of distance can affect how you tell a story.
Is that why you've chosen to write your books in this way? You've got the first novel from one person's perspective, and then it's not the same story, but it's in a similar landscape told from a totally different character's perspective, rather than writing like a sequel, what happens after.
Yeah, but I also do like the idea of different people trying to tell the same story, and it ends up being very different stories. It's kind of what happens in the Alexandra Quartet in Lawrence Durrell's books, Justine and Mount Olive and so on. I've always been fascinated by those books, or Jane Gardam's Old Filth trilogy. Where you revisit certain things. Because, two people looking at the same thing won't tell you the same thing. I don't remember where it was. Somebody was doing a news story on the anniversary of a lynching in the South. And because he asked the right question, he didn't go in and go, tell me about the lynching. He just says, tell me about 1938. And some people are talking about, when they took those boys out and lynched them and so on. Then he asked a white person, and you mean when those guys messed with that poor girl? Mm-hmm. And if he had said, tell me about the lynching, should have had a different answer.
Yeah.
Instead, because of that question, she'd had a totally different view on it, a false view. Mm-hmm. But it raises the whole idea about belief and so on. And one of the things that's not going to happen in this trilogy is me writing one where I tell you whose story to believe.
Yeah, well, that would be cheating.
Well, when I wrote Black Leopard, I believed him.
Yeah.
And when I wrote this, I believe her.
But it's so real for the person who's telling a story to be wrong.
Yeah.
And are you playing with the idea of truth?
Oh, absolutely. I'm also playing with the idea that you're going to have to define what truth is. Mm-hmm. And you're going to have to decide. It is fascinating talking to people who have read this book first.
There's people who've read this book
first? People who've read this book first.
Huh.
I tell people that in case I feel they have to buy the other one. I'm like, no, buy the new one. Yeah.
I didn't know that's what you... that's interesting.
Oh, yeah, well, because the book can be read they can be read in any order.
Yeah.
Which I always tell people, not because I want people to buy the book. Of course I don't want people to buy the damn book. But they can be read in any order. And it's interesting hearing from people who came to Sologon first.
Yeah.
Because they have to work hard to like Tracker.
Well, they've got the whole picture about why you shouldn't like Tracker and why you shouldn't... Yeah, why you're behind Sogolon's.
But then there are these really wonderful characters in Tracker's story that are not in this.
Yeah.
And I'm already getting shit from people about where's the buffalo.
Really?
People seem to love him.
Oh, I mean, great character. But
a person with firm was threatening, can I write a spin-off with just the buffalo and the Ogo?
But people will do that without asking for permission.
I'm like, listen, as somebody who, I've taught fan fiction, go for it. But they have a different perspective on it because they came in with Sogolon as a person they trusted first.
Yeah.
And to have to let go of that, because in Black Leopard, Sologon is a fanatic, and she sacrifices a lot of people for a very warped cause. Whereas in this book, she's like, "What do you mean cause? I knew the kid was an idiot. There are bigger things here, and I'm a bigger person." And we're dealing with, this version is her almost saying, "Look, this is an adult story now."
Yeah.
Tracker is a child.
Yeah.
And we need to talk about adult things here.
So what drives her to... She finds herself sort of in this forest environment. She's made community with the various animals and beasts around her, and she's taking up this name that's been put on her as the Moon Witch, and she's kind of working for a cause of protecting women. What is it that binds her to this higher cause?
I think because she starts to feel as if she belongs to no one. And I think because of that, then she starts to realize that she really does belong to everyone. Or at least she belongs to women.
Yeah.
And it's not something that she walked into. It's not something she did deliberately. I think she realized it was the only way she could survive, or the only way she could still be somebody that means something. And the meaning comes to her. She doesn't even realize the meaning until way near the end of the book, where all these women show up and start to say, "Moon Witch, she's me." She really didn't know. And I think there are times when you're working towards a greater goal and you don't realize that you are. Sometimes until somebody tells you.
She was even kind of resisting it.
She was kind of resisting it. And I think and I think that's how we are. I think for a lot of us, the true meaning of our lives is something that somebody else is going to know.
Yeah.
And somebody else is going to tell us. And I think maybe that's how it should be.
Oh, wow. I don't think I'm ready for somebody to tell me what my meaning is.
I know. I don't know, but I'm not sure I'm ready for me telling myself what my meaning is.
I don't want to know full stop.
Because I'm going, what kind of asshole thinks like that? what my purpose here is for. I have no clue why I'm
we
here.
shouldn't. That's for a higher knowledge. I don't want to know that. Just to quickly bounce back, actually, considering you said that the books aren't bound by any reading in a chronological order or reading first or second, I know it's being adapted for the screen. So how is that being taken into account? Is there going to be the first book and then the second book, or are they going to intermingle? Are we going to get the perspectives from all of these characters together?
I think it's going to be a first book and a second book, and we haven't gotten that far in it yet. But I know I can just imagine the type of actress who will be so excited about playing the same character in a totally different way.
Yeah.
In the second one or in the third one.
But that's not something that we've really had with TV and film.
Can't even tell somebody, yeah, you're the villain in book 2. in movie 2 or series 2 or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think it's the type of thing actors would jump at. And I think that the idea that each time we see this again on screen, it's a reset.
Yeah.
It's not a continuation. It's it's I like the idea of nothing is a given.
Yeah.
And nothing is sort of sacred in the story. And so we'll see. We're still in very, very early days, honestly. And then COVID added 2 years onto those early days.
Sure. And you have other projects and everything.
That's it, so yeah.
Before I move on to audience questions, I want to remark on the acknowledgement section of this book, where you give your mum permission to read this one. Did she not have permission to read the first?
Oh, it's a running gag in all my books.
Okay.
It's in the acknowledgements. I think one of them said my mom is allowed to read all but 2 pages of this book.
Yeah.
That was the previous one. My first novel said she's not allowed to read it. And she was go,
there is considerably more gay sex in the first one. And
Yeah.
if I was going to pull out an issue I have with the second one, Marlon, where did it go?
It's funny. So this joke does not leave this room. So my editor way back in Black Leopard said, and she was really trying to find a really sort of politic way of saying this to me. It's like, I also think that you may have used the word cock a little too much in the book. I was like, I'm sure it's not that much. So I did a spell search. 416.
That's impressive.
I was like, man, this is a gay-ass book.
That's on almost every. That's more than every other page.
I edit, because there's only 600 and so pages in the book.
Yeah.
So needless to say, I trimmed that down considerably.
Oh, I fully believed that was still the final number.
This week, oh my God, so this week I remember I wrote a scene between Sologon and Keme, and I was ecstatic. Like, oh my God, I wrote a straight sex scene, and I think it's hot. I was like, I sent it to like 4 people. I'm like, oh my God, I'm writing straight sex. It's like, it's so weird.
Did they agree that it was hot?
They did, and I'm like, man, I'm scoring some points here, because I'm like, I have no clue about straight stuff.
Is that why you threw in the lions?
Yes, I had to do something.
Well, this was...
So it's still shape-shifty sex.
Yeah, it's still magical.
Yeah, but one of the things, when you separate old tales from how we sanitize them, either through Christianity or through turning them into children's stories. I don't know how the hell Snow White became a children's story. Have you read the original Snow White? That is not a children's story. And I say children like torture. But there are 2 things that happen here. One, these stories are way wilder. But it's interesting how these stories for essentially illiterate people trust the audience.
Yeah.
Like, I get knocked about sex and violence all the time. I'm like, oh my God, I hope you're ready for Medea. Because Medea is ready for you. That there is, the type of the stories, the way in which they are not always explicit, but they are, or clever, or raunchy, or hold nothing back.
Yeah.
It's like, it's one thing when you're reading Shakespeare and Claudius kills Hamlet. It's another thing when you're reading the Oresteia, where they didn't just kill their children, they ate them. And this is not comedy. And how the ancient Greeks had to deal with a version of humanity where they have to accept some considerable flaws and shortcomings and just outright horrendous thing people do, and you still have to side with that character for the whole play. So in remembering that, I realized that actually my stories are pretty tame compared to some of the stuff. But, we were talking about this backstage where, and I'm sure, the violence thing inevitably comes up. And I usually have a standard answer to that, which is, it's not, I don't think my books have a lot of violence. But I do think violence should resonate because violence is not normal. It's not normal to do violent things to people. It's supposed to be shocking. It's supposed to disturb you. And I was in this really testy interview, and I noticed it hasn't aired yet, so I don't know what happened. And it was the umpteenth question about violence. And I said to the interviewer, I don't know why you're asking me about this, because you dig it. I was like, what? I was like, you totally dig violence. You don't dig mine, but you totally dig violence. I was like, you watch a film like Superman, where Superman and Zod are fighting in a city. They decimate the entire village, but you really think 8 million people were evacuated in 17 seconds?
Yeah, I always think about this with the Marvel films.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know to break this to you, but a couple million people have died in that scene. How about James Bond? So James Bond, I just watched No Time to Die, which I have big issues with. But so James Bond is in this scene where he's shooting all these people in a square. I'm like, people died here. And even if you only focus on the villain, some of those guys were fathers, some were brothers, some were children. And I said, I focus on violence because I can't look away. But you didn't you? Because I'm sure when you finished watching that movie, you never once thought about one person who was killed in it.
But what do you mean by normal? When you say violence isn't normal? No,
I'm saying that it's not normal for us to do. It's not. I mean, it's everywhere, but it's still not a normal thing to visit harm on someone. And it's not something that you should move away from. I mean, I love John Wick as much as anybody else, but it says something that we can just move on from it. And to me, that is violence that we find acceptable. That is gore that we can live with. That is stuff that we can totally put aside because the hero now has a girl and they're going off in the sunset. So then I said to the guy, so you need to examine your little kinky take on violence.
Do you feel like your response to that is just to be quite relentless with the violence?
No, and I don't think it's relentless either. I think it goes back to the original answer I usually have to this thing is actually talk about Led Zeppelin. And I talk about how Led Zeppelin has this reputation for being the heaviest of the heavy. They're the kings of heavy metal, which is really interesting because every Led Zeppelin album is about 60% acoustic. But anybody else, that's a folk record with some loud moments. But the thing is, the loud moments, when the levee breaks, the rock and roll, they resonate. So even after the song ends, they still echo. They still reverberate. So you could go through 4 ballads afterwards. Those loud moments still resonate. And for me, for violence, it's not that I have a lot of it. It's that it resonates. It reverberates. And it should.
It lingers.
It lingers because it should.
Yeah.
I also am interested in what harm does to bodies. And I think people should be interested.
Yeah.
Because this is something that's important.
And it's real.
And it's real.
Well, thank you very much for answering my questions so far. We have time for audience questions, so if anybody would like to put their hand up, we have a roaming microphone. Maybe while you're thinking how your arms move, I'll take a question from online. Okay. And
I'm a teacher. I'll just point.
Yeah. He's not joking. Naomi. Hi there. I don't know why I'm characterizing this. Thanks for your fascinating talk today. I was especially interested to hear you speak about how your characters reveal themselves to you. Do they speak to you in different voices to help you distinguish between them on the page, or is this something you consciously aim for?
I think they do speak to me in different voices. I'm trying to think of all those people who have been committed to asylums and they really should just be writing fiction. They do, but it's never sort of overt. I have to put in the work. I do think I have this feeling these characters start to just wait until they think I'm serious, and then they start to reveal. I do think, at least for me, that a fiction writer. I'm almost sort of a journalist for fictionalized people, and I want to get the story.
Like your record keeping.
Yeah. And bearing witness, and I want to get the story, and I think so. For me, a lot of it is listening. A lot of my writing really is me just sitting down staring at the computer, which is writing. Those of you who
staring is writing.
Yeah, those of you who kill yourselves over not writing. I sat down at the computer all day. That's writing. You heard it from me.
Are you even thinking about the writing, or are you somewhere?
Sometimes I'm not.
Yeah.
Because, man, I love to not write.
Oh.
One of the reasons why I think I write most of historical fiction is historical fiction needs a lot of research.
Yeah.
And I love researching because I love to not write.
I can't believe your research is your procrastination.
Oh, my God.
That's the hard part.
Almost every book I've written, I've researched enough to have written a book about the research. Like even books I haven't written. I almost wrote a book on Weimar era. Anybody need somebody to do cabaret? I'm your guy.
It's a good thing you're a teacher.
Yeah, except my students get all of this, and they're like giving us too much.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi, for that question. We also have another online one from David E. Thanks for a really lovely and interesting talk this evening. I really enjoy your podcast. They've been such a brilliant listen. Are you going to be doing a new series? And I'll let you explain what the podcast is.
Yeah, so my editor and I have this podcast called Marlon and Jake Read Dead People. And it happened because at any given moment, if Jake and I are in a room too long, we get into a heated but friendly argument, and everybody thinks it's about somebody else. And I'm like, no, dude, Hamlet did delay. What the hell? Everybody knows this. Or I'd go, we really love to argue about the Brontes.
Yeah, you really do.
Yeah. Because everybody knows The Tenant of Wildfield Hall is the greatest Bronte novel. Like, everybody knows this. Listen. It's Tenant of Wildfield Hall, Agnes Grey, Villette, Jane Eyre. Notice I did not mention Wuthering Heights because that's a terrible book. Anyway, so we get into fights like that. Although I think we agree on Wuthering Heights. But this was going on for years, and somebody said, we really should record you guys. And we were like, whatever. I'm like, let's talk about Dickens versus Trollope. Because I'm very Dickens and he's very Trollope. And until one day actually they literally just grabbed us and go, you know what, we're just going to move you. And they moved us into this room and there were microphones. And they go, just as you were.
Don't even need to be aware that it's recording.
Yeah, and we talk about a lot of really, really fun things. I think my favorite episode was Books to Film. Because people were shocked at what I think is my favorite film adaptation. What is the best film adaptation ever?
Oof. Don't ask me that.
So he was shocked at my answer. Die Hard.
I was going to say Fight Club, but...
Die Hard. Greatest film based on a book.
You've heard it here first.
If we're doing TV, clearly Pride and Prejudice. But then I'm biased towards Jane Austen, so...
Yeah, but which one?
Oh, the Colin Firth one.
Okay.
I hate when people add things that shows don't need, but it turns out we actually did need him rising from the thing. We kind of did need that, and I think Jane Austen would have been perfectly fine with that.
Are you in the camp that thinks Colin Firth is sexy?
Back then, yeah.
Back then, okay. That's an okay caveat.
The only problem with that scene is that he was a tad overdressed, but as opposed to the new Persuasion, which is garbage.
Oh,
but
I haven't watched it yet. I'm looking forward to having
Yeah,
time.
watch it so you don't have to.
Do we have another question from the audience this time? Anybody feeling brave? Lovely, right?
Oh.
Not that you're not the audience. You are very much the audience.
Hi. I don't know if it's okay to ask this question. If you don't want to answer it, just say so. But can I ask you a question about Seven Killings?
Sure.
I love that book. It blew me away. I always said it was my favorite book ever, but except Wuthering Heights was better. Sorry. In that book, it was just so I would like to reread it, but how is a writer, it was so complex, so many characters that started out being, you thought perhaps inconsequential, ended up being like dead important at the end. How do you as a writer do that for 800 some pages? Like, do you get them confused, or do you write like Joe Blogg's story all the way through and then intersperse it? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
No, I know. I totally get what you're answering. And you're right. I had to do things to not go crazy. And I actually did have charts up. And I had columns. And even if a character didn't appear in that story, I knew what they were doing. There are sections in the book, for example, I think the third section, which is a kind of stream of consciousness with one character. Even if it was 100 pages of Nina Burgess or whatever name she had there, I knew what Papalo was doing at the same time, or I would have gone mad, or I would have started playing favorites. Because I always fall in love with characters, and I love some characters more than others. This is why you'll never admit which children you love the most. So there was that. So I had to literally do record keeping to keep them intact. But I think at some point, certainly with that novel, I had to trust the story I was telling, and that was very hard. Because there's always that voice in the back of my head saying, this is crazy, this is so on, this is bad, this is a dumb move, don't do this. And because I'm a glutton for punishment, I always pick the wildest and craziest and dumbest idea and do that. And at one point, I remember telling myself, I'll just leave it in until my editor takes it out. And he didn't take anything out, so I figured, okay, maybe I was onto something. But I think you do have to trust whatever process you have. If you're a writer, you know that from this thing in your head to the page, a million things happen that can throw your writing off course. And I think you have to trust that. You'll have there's all the time to change. That's what second drafts are for. Or third drafts. I was at a writers conference earlier, and I was talking about people who put third draft pressure on a first draft. That's not the point of a first draft. Is supposed to be bad, and they're supposed to be wild, and it's supposed to not add up. I'm not even sure you should finish it. But But I had to get to the point where I had to trust what I was doing. Or just say, you know what, somebody smarter than me would tell me this is crap. And that's how that happened.
Thank you.
Now that we're on characters, I'd love to ask you about the character of the AC. Because what I really enjoy about this character, and I don't think this is a spoiler because it happens throughout, that idea of dying and returning and constantly coming back. This is a character that kind of symbolizes a lot of evil in the book. I hesitate to use the word evil, but a lot of darkness in the book. What are you sort of saying with that character and the regeneration?
Well, the easy is in some ways a derivation of Esu. And Esu in Yoruba mythology and Yoruba religion rather. I think the lazy equivalent that we usually give Esu is Satan. And Esu is not a devil. Esu does a lot of terrible things, but he's not. It's too lazy a comparison.
Yeah.
And the thing about Easy is, even though he does some really, really horrible, terrible, unforgivable, nasty things, if you were to ask me whose worldview I accept more, I accept his more than hers.
That's bold.
Because, and I can say that because I know how the third novel is going to turn out. And let's just say that the AEZ eventually says something that is so thoroughly unimpeachable, you're probably going to go back and go read the other two again.
Oh, God.
It doesn't just... I'm not even going to say it doesn't justify his actions, because, again, I'm throwing that burden on the reader.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about Beloved is how she throws that burden on the reader.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're going to read Beloved, you have to ask yourself the question, can murder be an act of love? Because she doesn't answer it, and you have to answer it as a reader. Don't ask me what my answer is, because I'm still figuring it out. But I love how she threw that on the reader.
Yeah.
And what is Aiz's worldview, and is he, what is he, is something that the reader is going to have to make their mind up about.
As a writer, is it is it exciting for you to know you're leaving your readers with questions?
Yeah. Some of the best books leave you with questions.
Yeah.
Not everyone, but some of the best ones leave you with. Or it's. I remember reading this novel, As Meat Loves Salt, by Maria McCann. It's one of my favorite novels. And when I tell people it's about a violent psychopath who doesn't become any less violent, by the way. And there are parts of that book where and you if you've read my book, you know I can write some sick shit. But I was reading that novel, I'm like, I don't think I can make it. I'm reading, I'm like, wow, I don't think I can finish this scene.
It's hardcore even for you.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't think I can make it. I mean, I'm like, what are you doing, Maria McCann? But then, this was my subway book, reading on the subway, which was a big mistake because I kept missing stops. And I mean, and it was the first book in years where I'm up at night. I'm literally up at night worried. I'm like, what's going to happen to him? And I was like, you can't read. I'm like, no, I should read it in the morning. But how am I going to sleep? What's going to happen to him?
You can't read a book like that at night.
And I'm like, but he's a psychopathic murderer. But I like when novels make you have very complicated, ambivalent views on a character.
Yeah.
Your characters. I'm trying to think of a character who I really didn't like, but I miss him so much. And what was it? Oh, Lord, I forget his name.
From the first book.
No, I'm talking books I've read.
Ah.
Oh, my first characters now they can go. But but I like that. I like novels that leave you with very complicated views of characters, and it unnerves you a little bit, and you like them and then you hate them here, and they're unreasonable, but they say something that strikes a core with you, and because that's how people are.
Well, it's important not to spoon feed your readers. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that front. Does anybody have another question? We have a wee bit of time. Right here. It's got to be really quick because we're in the last countdown.
Sorry, I'll just answer really quickly.
Yeah.
Snappy so somebody else can answer a question.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your time today. I just wanted to get your view on, I guess, the current fantasy fiction. There's a lot of diverse worlds, like the Broken Earth, the trilogy, and all of that. So, what are some of the most recent fantasy favorites that you would like, or you've heard about that you'd be interested in reading?
So I'm kind of an Alex Phoebe groupie. I was trying to contain myself yesterday when I met him.
You really were.
Yeah, you were there. I kept it together. Because I do think Marjorie is fantastic. I think he's really onto something. My students introduced me to the Poppy War. Because, when you're teaching a fantasy class with students, you have to accept that they know more than you. Which is not a hard thing for somebody as arrogant as me to accept. So I've really been into Poppy War. When I was way younger, the book I would steal from people younger than me was Witchibat. So Francesca Leo Block, if somebody you don't know, you may not know her, but your favorite fantasy writer knows who she is. And Francesca did a lot of things, including take the hit, basically, so the rest of us could write stuff. I remember, it's YA, and a lot of YA fantasy gets there first. And she, along with the horror people like Poppy Zebright, were doing things with non-binary, with queer characters, and so on. Witchibat has two dads. And one question, and I think she's asking, well, how was I born then? And is that, man, it was a drunk night, or so on. I think a lot of people objected that she called her boyfriend something like Red Hot Lover Man, which nobody wants a 14-year-old girl to say. But so I've been rereading that, lots of Poppy War. one of the things I teach Gormenghast, and the ways in which I teach Gormenghast is I'll spend a week on a principle I think people should really embrace as a fantasy teacher, and I go, and now we're going to read Gormenghast where he breaks every single rule I just told you to follow for the past 5 days, and let's see how he pulls off him doing everything I just told you not to do. And, it's interesting, there are all these best-of lists with fantasy, and Gormenghast is never on it, and I'm very surprised. I was very happy to make Time's list, but I was very pissed off that Gormenghast wasn't on it. Who else am I reading recently?
Well, that's a pretty good reading list.
I know. I could go on pretty much forever. I haven't even mentioned Sophia Samatar yet, who I love. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your questions and, for giving us some ideas on what to move on to next after everybody has read this book. We are at time, so thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Please join me in a huge thank you to Marlon for being with us today.
Thank you guys so much.